in the middle of Machiavelli's third discourse on Livy, he goes back to a couple of important events that took place at the very beginning of the Roman Republic. That is to say, events around the time when King Tarquin was expelled and the Republic was established, because there are some important lessons to learn from exactly what led to the expulsion of Tarquin and what led to the success of the Republic that was established in its place. Machiavelli says when there's a there's a new change, not a new change, what other kind of change is there? When there's a change in government, when there's a new system especially coming into place, there needs to be some memorable action that takes place by those who are forming the new order. There needs to be something dramatic that will sort of focus people's attention on the change and will remain in people's memories for a long time. Now, the person who was most responsible for the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud was Brutus. Of course, this is not the Brutus of 500 years later, who was part of the plot to kill Julius Caesar, although Brutus claimed to be a direct descendant of this original Brutus and claimed to be doing the same thing when he assassinated Julius Caesar. But Brutus, who was the most responsible, very shortly after that time, condemned his own sons to death and was present at their execution. They committed crimes, and Brutus said, "This shall not stand. Even my own sons, I must put aside my love as a father, and I must execute these if I'm committed to the principles that I claim to be committed to. I throw out a bad guy because he's unjust, because he doesn't punish crime." Talk about that in a minute. And where does that put me if I don't punish crime? Now that I've gotten rid of the old order. So it was very important for Brutus to do that. That's one of the key things that led to the success of the establishment and continuation of Rome's Republic. At this point, Machiavelli says, let me compare this with the events of 1512. Remember that in 1512, the Republic of Florence fell and the Medici returned. Let me go back and review that. It involves Machiavelli's boss, if you will, the leader of the Florentine Republic, Piero Soderini, who, by the way, had the very, very cool title of Gonfaloniere of Justice for Life. I think Machiavelli would be uncomfortable, was uncomfortable with the idea that he had this title for life. At any rate, when a real crisis came to the Republic in 1512, what did Piero Soderini do? The answer is not much. He thought that patience and goodness were sufficient to stop the return of the Medici. In other words, we're more just than the people trying to take our place. That should suffice. What Soderini, whom in many ways Machiavelli respected and worked with, what Soderini did not understand was that wickedness is not subdued by time. He needed to be like Brutus, but he was too passive. He was too dependent upon his own good qualities. He didn't adjust to the situation. Now, I want you to note that in 1512, the Republic of Florence had been in existence for 18 years, right? It was established following the exile of Piero de' Medici in 1494. Remember what Machiavelli said that I talked about in the last lecture? That you need renewal. In fact, you need it every 10 years or so. Well, it had been 18 years. And here was a great crisis in the Republic. And it, in a sense, had a chance to start afresh. But instead of starting afresh, what Soderini decided to do is stand pat and wait out this crisis. And I think what Machiavelli is arguing, if we can put this passage together with what we talked about in the last lecture, is here was a chance for bold action. A bold action in some ways parallel to the action that led to the beginning of the Roman Republic, the action of Brutus. But Soderini, he was no Brutus. He didn't take direct and strong action. He didn't do something risky, memorable, and dramatic. So that's the first point that Machiavelli makes about events that took place at the start of the Roman Republic. Here's the second. What led directly to the overthrow of King Tarquin, whom we call Tarquin the Proud, is that his son had raped a woman named Lucretia. The problem, Machiavelli says, was not with the action of his son. That Tarquin was in fact a tyrant, and that was the problem. Had Tarquin not been a tyrant and his son raped a woman, people would have gone to Tarquin and said, Tarquin, do justice. We expect you to do justice. But Tarquin was a tyrant, and he would not do justice to his son, and it's that led to the end of the monarchy. It was not the rape in and of itself. Machiavelli is making a very important historical point here. We very often look at the immediate cause of something, and we forget that we've got to look behind that. How many people would say today, the cause of World War I was the assassination that took place in Sarajevo of Archduke Francis Ferdinand? Well, obviously, in some ways, that did trigger World War I. However, what we also know is there have been a lot of political assassinations that didn't set the world at war. So the question you've got to ask behind that, what are the conditions that were such? How was Europe such a powder keg that the assassination of an Austrian duke could lead to a conflagration involving the world? That's really the most important question. That's exactly what Machiavelli is asking us to do here. We want to look behind the immediate cause, the rape of Lucretia, and say, if that rape had taken place in different circumstances, it wouldn't have had the same consequences, and therefore we need to know what those circumstances are so that whenever some awful action happens, and awful actions happen all the time, some individual malfeasance or whatever it is occurs all the time, you've got to make sure that if you are the leader of a state, that some individual act of malfeasance like that, some crime like that, the horrific crime of the rape of Lucretia, doesn't bring everything a tumbling down. And so once again, Machiavelli uses this as a way of getting us to think better as we read the past in ways that are useful. The longest single chapter in all of Machiavelli's Discourses is the chapter on conspiracies. I said that we would return to this topic in more detail when I mentioned that Machiavelli discussed it in The Prince. Here is where he really fleshes it out, and then of course he does it again in the Florentine Histories because, in fact, there are many conspiracies that he mentions and some that he goes into in great detail. Now, first of all, what causes conspiracies? Again, you can see how we are looking at that systematic Machiavelli that we've gotten so used to. What causes conspiracies? Well, there are different causes, of course, but the principal cause is the leader being hated by the people. We have seen throughout the Discourses how much Machiavelli emphasizes the people, that the people are superior to princes in so many ways. They may not be good at establishing republics, but they're more dependable. They're better judges than princes. So when the people turn against you, that is a time when you are susceptible to a conspiracy. A second kind of cause for a conspiracy is when there is a tyrant, because there will often be a conspiracy to get rid of that tyrant. Of course, the classic example is the conspiracy of Brutus and Cassius and the others against Julius Caesar. The famous events of 44 BC. Most of us probably know it best from Shakespeare's play, but in fact, Shakespeare uses as his source the ancient Roman, well, he's Greek, but he lived in Roman times, biographer Plutarch. Also, he says, we need to realize that hatred can be caused by two different things. One is not giving out any favors at all, and Some other times, giving out too many favors, simply being profligate. You give out so many favors, among other things, they can't last forever. And the example that Machiavelli gives is the Roman Emperor Commodus, who was the son of Marcus Aurelius, who was murdered. And it's really the reign of Commodus that leads to sort of a disintegration of the Roman Empire for quite a while, following the reign of Marcus Aurelius and then before him, Trajan and Hadrian, not in order, and so on. That period, what we call the five good emperors, roughly the 2nd century AD. So Machiavelli draws on contemporary things, on ancient Roman things, on not quite so ancient Roman things, in talking about conspiracies. Now, conspiracies are dangerous, not just for those being conspired against. Conspiracies are very dangerous undertakings because conspiracies are pretty easy to discover. It's hard to keep a secret, if you will. Why? Well, the main reason is, by definition, in a conspiracy, several people are involved. And I think all of us know the difficulty of keeping a secret when several people are in on it. And the conspiracy that Machiavelli spends so much time discussing in Discourse 3 is the 1478 conspiracy against the Medici, led by members of the Pazzi family, and therefore called the Pazzi conspiracy. Again, remember, Machiavelli is 9 years old when this series of events takes place. There's no reason to think Machiavelli actually saw any of the unfolding of the plot. But as I described it earlier in one of the background lectures, people ran through the streets, people were hanged from various buildings, people were literally chopped up into pieces who were involved in the conspiracy and thrown in the Arno. So it's hard to imagine that Machiavelli either A, didn't see some of that, or at least B, hear an awful lot of grisly stories told by Dad or Uncle Joe or whoever it might be, because this was such an extraordinary and dramatic event. If you want to read about it, by the way, there's a new book out. It's listed in the course materials. It's by a very well-known Renaissance historian named Lauro Martinez, and it's called April Blood. And I recommend it. It's a gripping tale as well as a good analysis. At any rate, Machiavelli says, if a lot of people are involved in the conspiracy, it's not just that one's going to give away the secret, that somebody's going to think out. But the bigger problem is that, there will be these stories that they've all rehearsed. Everybody's got a story, so they've got alibis or whatever it might be. The more people you get involved, the more likely somebody's going to say, gee, I just talked to A and I just talked to B, and they have different stories. And their stories of what they've done or what they're doing or what they're going to do or where they're going to be, those stories are incompatible. Something's up here. So it's very hard to have everybody, we might say today, on the same page during a conspiracy. Now, if there's just intrinsic problem with conspiracy, there are even more problems as the conspiracy unfolds. Let's take a look at what they are. Machiavelli lists 3. First of all, if you've got an elaborate conspiracy, and the Pazzi conspiracy was fairly elaborate, it was designed to take out 2 Medici. It was designed to take out Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was for all practical purposes the ruler of Florence, and his brother Giuliano. Okay, it was to get both of them. Well, a pretty complicated plot. The more complicated it is, the more likely it is that at the last minute there'll have to be some changes made. That, if it's a plot in, 17 steps, somewhere along the line, you're going to have to make a change. Secondly, he says, conspirators' courage may fail. It's one thing to sit down with some people and say, gee whiz, if we do this, we'll kick out that SOB, we'll get rid of the tyrant, or I may make some more money for that matter. Those are all easy things to say. It's a little bit harder to do when you're standing there with a knife in your hand in a crowd planning to execute somebody. So you're going to have the problem of personal courage. The third, most obvious problem is there can be some mistake made when the conspiracy is actually being executed. After all, people are tense and people are nervous and people are scared. Again, there are crowds. These were not things that were done in the dark of night very often. Think about where Brutus kills Julius Caesar. And similarly, the plot against the Medici was not one that was going to take place in the dark of night or in a back alley. It was going to be with a lot of people around. Now, Machiavelli said, those are the three problems around the time of execution. Let me tell you how all of these played out with the Pazzi conspiracy. First of all, the original plan was to kill the two Medici brothers while they were having dinner in a particular event that was taking place. The plan was all built around that, and then, because of some illness, Giuliano didn't go to dinner. And therefore, it had to be postponed, and that had to be reset up somewhere else. And the somewhere else turned out to be, because they had to pull it off fast. You can't say, gee, let's sit down, think about this for 3 more weeks, because you know it's going to get discovered. Where's the next place they're going to be together? Right, good question. Answer, at Mass in the Cathedral of Florence. So let's do it there. And that led to problem B that Machiavelli tells about. That is to say, that when they're ready to pull this off, somebody's courage fails. One conspirator refused to carry out his part in the Pazzi conspiracy because he would not murder somebody in a church. He'd murder somebody at dinner, but he wouldn't murder somebody at church. And therefore, the plot was weakened by the fact that you had somebody whose courage failed. I'll be tough at the dinner table. I cannot be tough at Mass. Third, a mistake can be made in the actual carrying out of the conspiracy. Exactly what happened, too, in the Pazzi conspiracy. As the person who was to kill Lorenzo de' Medici approached him, he gave himself away too soon by shouting as he came close to Lorenzo. You know, it's one thing to step up to a guy and you're 2 feet away and say, I'm going to kill you, and wham, you stab the knife in. But when you're 10 feet away and you're sort of moving that direction, say, Lorenzo, I'm coming after you, there's time for somebody to do something. And in fact, Lorenzo fled to safety in the sacristy of the Cathedral of Florence. Again, people who go to Florence can stand in front of the altar and see where this took place, and also see the sacristy on the left side, which is exactly where Lorenzo the Magnificent fled. So Machiavelli here is really giving us the anatomy of a conspiracy. Here are the causes, here are the problems, here are the way those problems actually work themselves out in the conspiracy that either I saw parts of, or at least the aftermath of, or I at least heard about as a great deal growing up. There's another problem that Lorenzo de' Medici, that Machiavelli points out, and that is, if you're going to kill off people like the Medici, don't you really also have to kill off the people who would be willing to avenge the Medici's death? In other words, you can't leave alive people who say, I'll risk my life to get the SOBs who took their lives. And of course, the Pazzi conspiracy only got one person, only got Giuliano, didn't even get the other Medici. It certainly didn't get other people who would come to the Medici defense. And so almost immediately there was a kind of popular movement. People came to the streets cheering for the Medici. And again, the conspirators were rounded up. The Pazzis lived almost around the corner from the Cathedral of Florence, and they were essentially wiped out as a family for a while anyway. Some were in exile. Not all were in Florence or involved in it, but all the ones who were involved were got rid of. The city took the coat of arms off the Pazzi Palace. It's back up again today for people to see. But nevertheless, it reminds us of the fact there were still a lot of Medici supporters, people who said, boy, I'm better off under the Medici than I can imagine myself being under anybody else ruling Florence, and therefore I'm going to commit to avenging the death of Giuliano, or for that matter, the death of Giuliano and Lorenzo, had it succeeded. And so this is an interesting sort of really an anatomy lesson that he gives us in terms of looking at the various questions, looking at detailed answers, looking at detailed examples. It's a most remarkable piece on the nature and problems of conspiracy. Machiavelli then turns to a theme that's related to what he said about Piero Soderini that I mentioned earlier in this lecture, and that is that the most successful leaders change with the times. There's a time to be bold and a time not to be so bold. There's a time to charge and there's a time to retreat. And it's very difficult for any leader to change when the circumstances demand a different response. And Machiavelli once again turns to Livy, not to the first 10 books, but to the Hannibal stories, the story of the Second Punic War, because he looks at the dictator Fabius. Now again, Fabius has a nickname that we still call him by. I'll use the English rather than the Latin. Fabius the Delayer. When he was selected to be the dictator of Rome for a while, his method was don't engage Hannibal directly in battle. You might attack the rear guard here, you might attack a food supply line there, but don't go into pitched battles because Hannibal's won every one of those. He's going to win more if we take him on that way. Fabius the Delayer. And for the brief period he was dictator, he really set a Roman policy that took a while to be successful, but it was successful, and Hannibal withdrew and went back to Carthage. When Hannibal went back to Carthage, Fabius, although no longer in office, was still alive. And when Scipio decided to take the Roman army to North Africa to fight Carthage and to fight Hannibal, Fabius, of course, opposed it. Fabius said, no, we don't fight Hannibal that way. We delay. We attack the rear guard, and so on. It's been working. Don't blow it now, was Fabius's advice. Machiavelli says Fabius's actions as dictator were good. Fabius's advice later on was bad because the situation had changed, and Scipio was right that now it required aggressive action against Hannibal. Fabius didn't change. And Machiavelli makes a very interesting point here. Had Fabius been king, meaning, of course, ruling for life, had Fabius been king, he would have been right as long as Hannibal was in Italy, and he would have been wrong when Hannibal returned to North Africa, and that wrong decision might have cost Rome the war. It's very hard for people to change. It's very hard for leaders to say, I've always been somebody who's sort of worked the sidelines. I've never been the real aggressor. To say, oh my gosh, it's time to be aggressive. I'm going to be aggressive. Now, I think you see where I'm going with this. In a republic, office holders change over time. And if the citizens, think about what Machiavelli says earlier, if the citizens are virtuous, if they're controlled and orderly and whatever, citizens will choose office holders to fit the times. And that, again, makes a republic better than a monarchy. There was a need for Rome to change tactics. Rome's a republic. Rome had different people in office at those different times. There was a time when Fabius was the best guy to put in charge, and there was a time for Scipio to be in charge and go attack Hannibal in North Africa, in what's now the nation of Tunisia. And so this again reminds us of the greatness and the superiority of a republic, because the people are better at choosing magistrates. Machiavelli said that directly in Discourse 1, more able to choose magistrates than a prince, and therefore a republic has a longer life than a principality. Again, Machiavelli returns to Piero Soderini. He was really good at being, we might say, somewhat laid back and unaggressive. And for most of the time he led the Florentine Republic, that was good for Florence. When it came time for bold action, he couldn't do it. He couldn't pull the trigger in a real sense. And as a result, the Florentine Republic came to an end. Just as individuals have to respond to different circumstances, so do societies generally. Nations, cities fall when they don't modify their institutions and their practices over time. In some ways, although Machiavelli doesn't make this point, there are historians who say one of the problems that led to the collapse of the Roman Republic was the Republic's basic institutions were created at a time when Rome was a small, essentially agrarian state. But by the end of the Republican times, Rome was it was the Mediterranean power. That Rome didn't significantly enough adjust to the new realities. It was too, if you will, conservative in its institutions to be able to survive the new realities. It didn't adjust enough to deal with those new realities. Although Machiavelli doesn't make that particular point, this is derived from the general point that Machiavelli makes. States, just like individual leaders, if they're going to continue to be successful, need to change because circumstances certainly change. Now, in the last few minutes of this lecture, and the last few minutes of our discussion of the Discourses on Livy, I want to give you a quick rundown of some of the final points that Machiavelli makes, many of them being, in a sense, reiterations of points he's made earlier. Machiavelli challenges the belief that great commanders make for great victories. Again, great commanders are important. Having great soldiers is what's important. And he tells some new stories out of Livy that he's not told before to illustrate that point. Machiavelli looks at the end of the Roman Republic and says, what caused it? What happens? He returns to two themes he talked about in Discourse 1. Number one were the struggles over the agrarian laws that caused hatred between the aristocracy and the people. And as we saw, the people gathered a champion to fight for them, Marius. And then the aristocracy had its own champion, Sulla. And you had this conflict between these two classes that had lived in a kind of creative tension within the institutions of the Roman Republic up to that time. The second cause for the collapse of the Roman Republic was the lengthening of military commands. That meant both re-election as consul, because originally you could only serve as consul once every 10 years, and also the extension of the office of dictator longer and longer and longer. So he reiterates those as the principal causes for the collapse of the Roman Republic. Machiavelli argues that citizens must not become like the nobility. Remember, he talks about the fact that there's certain nobility, and they don't really do anything to earn a living. Other people do things to earn their living. You can't let a lot of the citizens take on the role of noble, because that will sort of ruin the balance. You can have nobles, you can have a few of them, hopefully not very many at all. That's been one of Florence's strengths, and they shouldn't be too strong. That's okay. Again, they may provide an element of aristocracy in a full-fledged republic, but you can't have everybody in the people saying, gosh, I want to be that. On the other hand, Machiavelli says, one of the ways to prevent that is you must not let poverty or social status determine who can hold office. It must be the most able, not the wealthy, not those who are born to the greatest parents or whatever. And the great example of somebody very poor stepping to the forefront of the Roman Republic is Cincinnatus, who left his humble plow to go off and win a quick victory for Rome, and then he returned to his plow. Cincinnatus is the example. You must make use of everybody in the Republic for the offices that they're able to hold, and not make aristocracy a requirement, not make nobility a requirement for office holding. Machiavelli points out that the Romans were never humiliated by defeat, nor did they ever become arrogant when they won. Machiavelli argues that what makes a good army, in addition to good individual soldiers, is that they are cohesive. They need to know one another. They need to have been raised in the same place and with the same religion, same moral values. Therefore, once again, you need your own army from your own place, an army made up of your own people. We've certainly heard that. And finally, Machiavelli points out that there are certain attributes in nations and in families that don't change. He reads about the ancient Gauls in Livy and says, the French are still sort of like that. Well, we don't think much of that today, perhaps, that sort of notion that there's this sort of ethnic strain, we know what Germans are always like or French always like or whatever. But Machiavelli is very clever about this. He says it's not about blood, it's about the nature of tradition and education. That the continuity doesn't come through any sort of magic thing of blood. It comes through education. You need to have a culture that passes on the values, that has the standards, the parameters that your society is going to live in. And that's the culture that can lead to the soldiers and the office holders that will make a successful republic.